She hit the platform before anyone could catch her medical bag, splitting open instruments, scattering across the wood like broken promises, her hands too exhausted to stop the fall. The last train had already gone. No one was waiting. No one was coming. And Elizabeth Morgan lay on the cold boards of Willow Creek Station, staring up at a Wyoming sky that didn't care who she was or what she had sacrificed to get here, while everything she had left in this world rolled slowly toward the edge of the platform. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. We want to know how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory. Summer of 1886. Elizabeth Morgan had made the journey in silence. 3 days on the eastbound train from Chicago. 2 days on the connecting line west. 14 hours on a local cattle car that stopped at every water tower between Cheyenne and the edge of nowhere. She had eaten half a biscuit on the second morning and told herself she wasn't hungry. She had slept upright in a wooden seat and told herself she wasn't tired. She was very good at telling herself things that weren't true. The medical bag she carried weighed 11 pounds. She knew because she had weighed it before she left, standing in the empty apartment she had surrendered, counting what remained of her life by the ounce. 2 sets of surgical instruments. 3 bottles of carbolic solution. Bandage rolls, suture thread. A small bottle of laudanum for emergencies. Her medical reference text water-stained at the corners. And folded into the inside pocket, pressed flat, by everything else a single letter. The letter from Willow Creek. We are in desperate need of medical care for our settlement. We cannot offer much in the way of salary, but we offer honest work and a place to begin again. If you are willing, we will be waiting. It was signed by a man named Harold Briggs, identified as the operator of the Willow Creek Trading Post and informal leader of the small ranching community that had grown up around the creek. Elizabeth had read that letter 47 times. She knew because she had counted. She had nothing else to count. When the cattle car finally lurched to a stop, and the conductor called out Willow Creek in the tone a man uses for a place he considers barely worth the effort of naming, Elizabeth stood. Her knees protested. Her back had developed an ache somewhere around the Nebraska border that had since migrated into her shoulders and taken up permanent residence. She lifted her medical bag, adjusted the worn leather strap across her shoulder, and walked to the door. The platform was empty. Not just quiet. Not just understaffed. Empty. No horses tied at the post. No wagon waiting. No man named Harold Briggs with a welcoming handshake and the honest work he had promised. Just the wooden boards of a station that looked like it hadn't been properly attended to since the previous decade. A rusted water barrel with a split in the side, and the retreating sound of the cattle car already pulling away from the platform, as if it too had decided there was nothing worth staying for in Willow Creek. Elizabeth set her bag down. She stood very still for a moment, the way a person stands when they need to convince their body not to respond to what their mind has just understood. Then she picked up her bag again, walked to the far end of the platform, and looked down the single dirt road that led away from the station and into the settlement beyond. A handful of buildings, a water tower, the distant shape of a church steeple. And between her and all of it, a quarter-mile of open ground in the darkening evening air, with a wind coming down off the mountains that cut right through the thin traveling jacket she was wearing, because she had sold her heavier coat before leaving Chicago to cover the cost of the ticket. She started walking. She made it approximately 30 feet before she stopped, because standing in front of the general store at the near edge of town was a woman in an apron, and the expression on that woman's face when she saw Elizabeth was not welcome. It was not surprise. It was not the cautious but hopeful look of a community that had been waiting for medical help. It was pity, the deep, uncomfortable, already apologizing kind. "You're the nurse," the woman called out. "I am," Elizabeth said. "Elizabeth Morgan. I'm looking for Harold Briggs. He wrote to me about—" "Harold passed," the woman said. 6 weeks ago now. Heart gave out." Elizabeth heard the words. She understood them individually. Together they arranged themselves into a shape that her mind refused to immediately accept. "He passed." "Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry. We sent a letter to the address he had for you, but—" The woman gestured vaguely the way people gesture when they know the gesture doesn't help. "It must not have reached you in time." No, Elizabeth said. It didn't. She stood in the middle of the dirt road between the train station and the edge of Willow Creek, and she understood with a clarity that was almost peaceful in its completeness, that there was no position waiting for her. There was no clinic. There was no salary, however modest. There was no fresh start. There was a dead man's letter in her pocket, and 11 pounds of medical equipment in her hand, and approximately $4.30 in the small purse she kept sewn into her underskirt, which was not enough to get anywhere from here. "Is there somewhere I can stay tonight?" Elizabeth asked. Her voice was level. She was very proud of how level her voice was. "The boarding house has a room," the woman said. "Mrs. Hadley runs it. I can take you." "Thank you." She followed the woman in the apron down the street and tried very hard not to think about the fact that she had left everything behind to come here. Mrs. Hadley was a woman of about 60, with the kind of face that had probably been warm once and had since settled into something more cautious. She showed Elizabeth to a room on the second floor, small, clean, the window facing the back alley, and named a price for the night that was reasonable by any standard, except the standard of a woman with $4.30 to her name. "I'll need to find work," Elizabeth said. "In Willow Creek." Mrs. Hadley looked genuinely uncertain. "What kind of work?" "I'm a nurse. I have training and experience. Nearly 10 years. The older woman's expression shifted not to dismissal, but to something complicated. "We had Doc Randall for the territory, but he's getting on in years, and he mostly stays to his office now. I don't know that he'd take kindly to—" She stopped herself. "To a woman," Elizabeth said. Mrs. Hadley had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "To someone he didn't know." It was a gentler version of the same thing, but Elizabeth didn't have the energy to point that out. "I understand. Thank you for the room." She sat on the edge of the bed after the door closed. She did not let herself cry. She had learned in the months since Chicago that crying was a luxury for people who had somewhere soft to land afterward, and she did not have that. Instead, she opened her medical bag, inventoried the contents, a habit from nursing school that she had never been able to break, and then folded her hands in her lap and sat in the quiet of a room in a town that hadn't asked for her, and thought about what came next. What came next was she had to find a way to be useful, not because someone would reward her for it, but because being useful was the only thing she knew how to be, and she was not willing to stop. She was at the general store the next morning when she first heard Thomas Walker's name. She hadn't slept much. The bed was adequate, but the silence of the Wyoming night was a different kind of silence from anything she had known in Chicago. Deeper, more absolute, the kind that made your own thoughts louder. She had lain awake listening to her own thoughts for several hours before deciding that was unproductive and rising at 5 to wash her face and go find coffee. The general store was owned by a man named Caleb Marsh, who was selling supplies to a rancher when Elizabeth walked in. The rancher was a large man in a canvas work coat, and he was describing an injury to one of his hands in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had decided the injury was simply a fact of life now rather than a problem to be solved. "Third finger's gone dark at the tip," the rancher was saying. "Been like that for 5 days now. Jackson says it doesn't hurt much anymore." "That's not a good sign," Elizabeth said. Both men turned to look at her. "Numbness after a wound turns dark is a sign of deep infection," she said. "The tissue is dying. He needs the wound cleaned properly and treated with carbolic solution immediately, or he risks losing the finger, and depending on how far the infection has progressed, possibly more than that." The rancher stared at her. "Who are you?" Caleb Marsh asked. "Elizabeth Morgan. I'm a nurse. I arrived yesterday." She looked at the rancher. "Would you let me see to your worker?" A pause. The kind of pause that contained a great deal of unspoken evaluation. "You know something about wounds?" the rancher asked. "I treated infected wounds for 2 years at Cook County Hospital," she said, "including injuries very similar to what you're describing." Another pause. "Name's Garrett," the rancher said finally. "My spread's about 2 miles out. If you want to ride out and take a look, I won't stop you." It wasn't enthusiasm, but it was an opening. "Let me get my bag," Elizabeth said. Jackson was 23 years old, and trying not to show how scared he was. He was sitting on a bale of hay in Garrett's barn, with his right hand wrapped in a piece of cloth that had not been changed in several days, and when Elizabeth unwrapped it, both of them had to breathe through their mouths for a moment. "How did this happen?" she asked, keeping her voice entirely neutral. "Fence wire," Jackson said. "Caught me across the back of the hand." "When?" "8 days ago." Elizabeth looked at the wound. Deep ragged, the edges swollen, and the tissue around the deepest point beginning to show the color that meant what she had feared it might mean. "All right," she said. "This is going to hurt. I'm not going to tell you otherwise because lying to patients doesn't help anyone. But I can clean this properly, and we can stop it from getting worse. Do you understand?" Jackson looked at her with the expression of a young man trying to decide if he trusted her. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." She opened her bag. "Hold as still as you can." He held still. He was white-knuckled and silent, and gripped the edge of the hay bale with his left hand hard enough to leave marks, but he held still. Elizabeth worked quickly and methodically, cleaning the wound with carbolic solution, removing the damaged tissue that could not be saved, applying a proper dressing with instructions for how to change it and signs to watch for. When she finished, Jackson let out a long breath. "That better or worse than you expected?" she asked. "About even," he said. "Ma'am, how'd you know about the numbness?" "Because I've seen it before," she said. "And because paying attention to what people describe is the most important skill in medicine. Most doctors don't listen carefully enough." She packed up her bag. "Come back in 3 days and let me see it, or send for me if anything changes before that." Garrett was waiting outside. "You did that well," he said. It was not exactly a compliment in tone, but it was closer than anything she'd received in a long time. "I know what I'm doing," Elizabeth said. "You said you're looking for work." "I am." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I can't pay you much." "I'm not asking for much." "I'll mention you to some folks," he said. "Can't promise anything, but I'll mention you." It wasn't a position. It wasn't a clinic. It wasn't anything close to what Harold Briggs's letter had promised. But it was something. She had been in Willow Creek for 4 days when she first saw Thomas Walker. He came into Mrs. Hadley's boarding house on a Thursday evening, the same way he apparently came every 2 weeks to deliver a monthly payment. He had set up for the older widow, who was distantly related to someone he'd once worked with. Elizabeth would learn this later, but at the time she was simply sitting in the small parlor area, trying to compose a letter to a medical reference in Denver, when the door opened and a tall man in a dark hat came in and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. He looked at her. It was a brief exchange, 5 seconds perhaps less, before Mrs. Hadley came from the kitchen, and the man turned his attention to her, handing over an envelope and exchanging a few quiet words. But Elizabeth noticed just 3 things in those 5 seconds. He moved quietly for a man his size. His hands were scarred in the particular way of a man who worked with them constantly without being careless about it. And when he looked at her, he didn't look at her the way most men in Willow Creek had looked at her, with suspicion or dismissal, or the particular kind of concern that was really just another word for disapproval. He looked at her the way you look at something you haven't seen before and aren't sure yet what to make of. Then he was gone. "Who was that?" Elizabeth asked Mrs. Hadley. "Thomas Walker," the older woman said. "Runs the big cattle operation up the North Valley. Keeps mostly to himself." She paused. "Lost his wife 4 or 5 years back now. Hasn't been the same since." Elizabeth nodded and went back to her letter. She didn't think about him again. At least not that evening. The thing about small towns. Elizabeth had learned in Chicago, in the neighborhoods where she worked, was that word traveled faster than you expected and arrived in forms you didn't anticipate. By the end of her first week in Willow Creek, 3 people had come to find her based on what Garrett had apparently told people. A woman with a child who had a fever that had persisted for a week. An elderly man with a wound on his leg from a farming implement that he had been treating with a poultice of dubious composition. A teenage girl who had been having headaches so severe she could barely stand, and who had been told by everyone around her that it was probably nothing. Elizabeth treated the fever, cleaned and properly dressed the leg wound, and sat with the teenage girl for an hour asking careful questions before determining that the headaches were almost certainly connected to the fact that the girl was doing close needlework for 12 hours a day in very poor light. "You need to rest your eyes," Elizabeth told her. "Work by better light. And for now this." She showed the girl's mother how to make a cool compress. "That's it," the mother said. "She doesn't need medicine." "Medicine won't fix the cause," Elizabeth said. "Removing the cause will fix the cause." The mother was quiet for a moment. "What do we owe you?" she asked. "Nothing," Elizabeth said. "If your daughter's headaches improve in 2 weeks, you can tell someone else I'm available. That's all I ask." It was the second week when she encountered Dr. Randall. He was not what she'd imagined from Mrs. Hadley's careful description. She had expected a tired old man comfortable in his routine. What she found when he appeared at the boarding house door and asked to speak with her was a man in his late 60s with sharp eyes and a walking stick, and the deliberate manner of someone who has decided they are going to control the temperature of a conversation before it begins. "I understand you've been practicing medicine in my territory," he said. Elizabeth met his gaze. "I've been providing nursing care to people who needed it, without a license to practice in Wyoming territory." "Nursing doesn't require a territory license," she said, "and I have a certificate from the Illinois State Board of Nursing and 7 years of documented hospital practice behind me." "People could confuse what you do with medical practice," he said. "People who need their wounds cleaned and their children's fevers treated are not confused about what they need," Elizabeth said. "They're just in pain and looking for help." Randall looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. "What brings you to Willow Creek?" he asked. She told him about Harold Briggs's letter, the dead end she had arrived to find. Something shifted very slightly in his face. "I'm not your enemy," he said finally, and his voice was slightly less formal when he said it. "I'm 68 years old, and I have arthritis in both hands. I can diagnose. I cannot always do what needs to be done after the diagnosis." He paused. "But I need to be able to trust your competence." "Then let me demonstrate it," Elizabeth said. Another long pause. "Come to my office tomorrow morning," he said. "Early." She went. Dr. Randall's office was a revelation, not because it was impressive, but because it showed clearly what happened when one aging doctor with limited physical capacity tried to serve a territory of several hundred people spread across dozens of miles of Wyoming landscape. Files everywhere. Cases pending for months. A supply cabinet with significant gaps. A list of patients he hadn't been able to visit pinned to the wall with such careful handwriting that she understood he had organized it and reorganized it, unable to do anything about it. He showed her a case file. "Tell me what you see," he said. She read it carefully. A rancher mid-40s with a cluster of symptoms that had been attributed to various causes over 18 months. "These symptoms together suggest a kidney problem," she said. "Not the digestive issue you've been treating." Randall was quiet. "I thought so too," he said quietly. 3 months ago. But without a second opinion, I wasn't certain enough to act." They looked at each other across the desk. "Can we work together?" Elizabeth asked. "That depends," he said, "on whether you can do this without making me look like I need help." "I don't care how it looks," she said. "I care whether the patients get better." Something in his face changed again. This time it looked very close to respect. "Come back tomorrow," he said. "And the day after. We'll see how this goes." She was returning from Dr. Randall's office on the third day of this arrangement, walking back through town in the early afternoon when she heard the shouting. It was coming from the direction of the livery stable. Elizabeth turned and moved toward it, because moving toward trouble was a habit so deeply ingrained from years of hospital work that she did it before she finished deciding to. A horse had spooked. The animal was wild-eyed and pulling against the rope being held by a young stable hand who was clearly losing the battle, and several bystanders were shouting contradictory advice. And in the middle of all of it was a man who had apparently been in the process of shoeing the horse and had taken the impact of a panicked hoof directly to the shoulder. He was on the ground, trying to get up, not succeeding. Elizabeth pushed through the bystanders without ceremony. Everyone stop shouting, she said, and there was something in her voice. Years of hospital corridors, years of controlled emergencies that made people actually stop. She knelt beside the man. "Don't try to move yet," she said. "Tell me where the pain is." He pointed, jaw tight. "Can you move your fingers?" He moved them. All of them. That was good. "The shoulder joint has been impacted," she said. "I need to determine whether anything is broken. This will hurt. Ready." He nodded. She was pressing carefully along the shoulder, assessing when she became aware of someone standing directly behind her. Standing quietly, not interfering, not adding to the chaos, and she looked up. Thomas Walker. He was holding the rope of a horse, which had stopped fighting the moment he'd taken hold of it. Apparently, the animal had decided within seconds that this was not a person to struggle against. "Nothing broken," Elizabeth said, turning back to her patient. "Bad bruising, possible deep muscle damage. He needs rest support, and—" She reached into her bag and found what she needed. "This will help with the pain and inflammation." "Can he be moved?" Thomas asked. She looked up again. His voice was quieter than she'd expected, directed at her specifically, not at the crowd. Carefully, "Are you going to help?" "Yes," he said. He handed the horse rope to the stable hand and came forward, and together, Elizabeth directing Thomas, lifting with the steady competence of a man who had done hard physical work his entire life. They got the injured man settled on a bench inside the stable, where Elizabeth could complete her assessment properly. It took about 20 minutes. When she finished, she became aware that the crowd had drifted away. The stable hand was managing the horse. The injured man was settled and less pale, and Thomas Walker was still there. "You knew what to do," he said. "Yes," Elizabeth said. She was putting her instruments back in order. "You're the nurse everyone's been talking about." "Apparently." She glanced at him. "You handled that horse well." "He was scared," Thomas said simply. "Didn't need fighting. Just needed someone to stay calm." She stopped what she was doing for just a moment. "That's true of most patients too," she said. He looked at her, that same unreadable look from the boarding house. The one that wasn't judgment, but wasn't familiarity either. "I have a ranch," he said. "North Valley. 40 workers this time of year, some with families. No medical care closer than Randall in town, and he can't travel the way he used to." A pause. "I can't offer a full salary. I can offer room meals and what I can manage weekly. And the work would be real work." Elizabeth looked at him. "Why?" she asked. He seemed faintly surprised by the question. "Because I watched you work just now," he said. "And because my people need someone who knows what they're doing." Another pause, shorter. "And because you look like someone who needs somewhere to go." It was the most direct thing anyone had said to her since she'd arrived in Wyoming. It was also entirely accurate. "I'm still working with Dr. Randall in town," she said. "I'd need to be able to continue that." "That's fine, and I make my own decisions about how I treat patients. I wouldn't have it any other way." She looked at him for another moment. "I'll come out tomorrow and see the place," she said. "And the people. And then I'll decide." He nodded. "Fair enough." He picked up his hat from where he'd set it down when he took the horse, and he walked out of the stable, and Elizabeth watched him go, and thought about a man who handled panicked horses, not by fighting them, but by being calmer than the thing causing the panic. She thought about that for longer than she intended to. She came to the Walker Ranch the following morning. She had expected functional. She had not expected how much life there was in the place, children running between the buildings, women calling to each other across the yard, the rhythm of work that had been going on since dawn and would continue past dark. 40 workers meant 40 lives, and 40 lives meant the full range of human need. Thomas met her at the gate and walked her through. How was different on his own property? Not warmer exactly. Warmth wasn't a word that fit him naturally. She was starting to understand, but more present. He knew every person by name. He stopped to answer questions, check on work, give quiet directions. The people around him were comfortable in a way that told her more about him than anything he might have said directly. "This is Henry," he said, stopping beside a man in his 50s who was working near the main structure. He's been having trouble with his right knee for about 2 months. Henry looked slightly embarrassed. It's nothing, sir. Just, would you let me look at it? Elizabeth asked. Henry glanced at Thomas. She's the nurse, Thomas said. Dr. Morgan. Miss Morgan, Elizabeth corrected automatically. Miss Morgan, Thomas repeated without apology. She knows what she's doing. Henry let her look at the knee. She asked questions how it started, when it was worse what movements caused the most difficulty. Henry answered with the cautious brevity of a man not accustomed to talking about his own pain. It's the joint itself, she said after a few minutes. Probably been building for a long time. There are things we can do to manage it, but I want to be honest with you, this is a chronic condition. It won't disappear, but it can be made significantly better. Henry stared at her. Better, he repeated. Yes. Doc Randall told me I'd have to live with it. You will have to live with it, she said. But living with it has a wide range of possibilities. Right now, you're at one end of that range. We can move you toward the other end. Something shifted in the older man's face. Something that in another context she might have called hope, but that in this particular man, in this particular moment, looked more like the tentative consideration of something he had stopped allowing himself to feel. All right, Henry said slowly. I'll try. She looked up and found Thomas watching. Not watching her the way people watched someone they wanted to evaluate. Watching the way you watch something you haven't allowed yourself to want and are just beginning to understand that you might. She looked away first, but she accepted the position. The first 2 weeks at the ranch were the fullest 2 weeks she had known since Chicago, and full in a completely different way. In Chicago, the fullness had been the desperate compression of too many patients, too few resources, too many people deciding which suffering was most deserving of attention. At Walker Ranch, the fullness was different. It was discovering one person at a time how much need had been silently accumulating in these people's lives, simply because no one had been paying attention. Infected cuts treated with the wrong things. Joint pain managed badly or not at all. A woman who had been having headaches for months that turned out to be connected to a dental problem. A connection. Elizabeth caught because she asked the right questions. Children who had been told their frequent coughs were normal when they were not. She worked from early morning until the light failed. She ate with the workers when she was there at mealtimes. She slept in a small room off the main building that had apparently been used for storage and was now cleared and furnished with the basic minimum. Thomas did not hover. He did not interfere. He checked in once a day, a brief conversation, usually in the evening, usually about something practical. Did she need supplies? Was there anything she needed access to? Were there any situations he should know about? Anderson in the south bunkhouse, she said one evening. He's been hiding a cough for about 3 weeks. I found out from his bunkmate. Thomas was quiet. Is it serious? He asked. It could become serious if it's not treated now. I'd like to bring him to Randall for a full assessment, but I need to convince him to go. He's afraid of what it might mean. I'll talk to him, Thomas said. Don't pressure him. I know, he said simply. I'll just talk to him. He did. She didn't know exactly what he said, but the next morning Anderson came and found her and said with studied casualness that he reckoned he could ride into town if she thought it was worth the trouble. She told him it was worth the trouble. It was. The cough caught early was treatable. Caught later would not have been. Afterward, Anderson shook her hand with a grip that was too tight because he was trying to communicate something he didn't have words for. She shook back just as firmly. It was on a Tuesday evening, in her 3rd week at the ranch, when most of the workers had gone to their bunks and the property had settled into its nighttime quiet, that Thomas came to find her, not about a patient. She was sitting on the step outside the small room, getting air after a full day, when she heard his boots on the packed dirt. He stopped a few feet away. You don't have to stay out here, he said. You're allowed to come to the main house. I know, she said. I like the quiet. He looked at the sky the way men who spend their lives outdoors look at skies as information, not decoration. You're good at this, he said. Yes, she said. Because she was, and she had spent too long letting other people's opinions make her doubt it. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely a change in the line of his mouth, but she caught it. Most people say thank you when someone gives them a compliment, he said. I know, she said. But you weren't giving me a compliment. You were making an observation. I was agreeing with the observation. This time, the almost smile became something more definite. It changed his face in a way she hadn't anticipated. How long have you been a nurse? He asked. Nearly 10 years, she said. Why did you leave Chicago? She was quiet for a moment. She had told parts of this story. To Mrs. Hadley in truncated form. To Garrett in even shorter form. She had not told it completely to anyone since she'd arrived in Wyoming. I reported a senior physician, she said. He had made mistakes that cost patients their lives. He was well-connected and respected, and when I brought evidence to the hospital board, they chose to believe his version of events rather than mine. A pause. I lost my position. My professional references were called into question. No hospital in Chicago would take me. Thomas was listening. Not in the slightly uncomfortable way people listened to bad news when they were planning their response. Actually listening. The letter from Harold Briggs was the only opportunity I had, she said. I used the last of what I had saved to make the journey. Silence. And then he was already dead, Thomas said. And then he was already dead, she agreed. More silence. The Wyoming night settled around them. The doctor who drove you out, Thomas said. Was he ever held accountable? No, she said. A beat. Not yet, she added. Thomas looked at her. Not yet, he repeated. I still have the evidence, she said. I kept everything. Every record, every note, every date. I brought it with me because I didn't know where else to put it. She looked at the sky. I haven't decided what to do with it yet, but I have it. He nodded slowly. You're not done with it, he said. No, she said. I'm not. They sat in the quiet for a while longer, not saying much, not needing to, and Elizabeth Morgan, sitting on the step of a converted storage room on a cattle ranch in Wyoming, felt something shift slightly in the tight, exhausted knot she had been carrying in her chest since Chicago. It wasn't resolved. It wasn't healed. But it was a fraction lighter. She noticed that Thomas Walker had not once in the entire conversation told her what she should do. He had only listened. And for a woman who had spent 10 years being told what she was allowed to do, and when she was allowed to do it, and whether her experience and knowledge and judgment were to be trusted, that was something she had not known she needed until she felt the absence of the opposite. She went inside eventually. And for the first time in months, she slept without her thoughts being louder than the night. The morning after their conversation on the step, Thomas Walker was gone before dawn. Elizabeth didn't know this until she came out to begin her rounds and found Henry near the main structure, who told her without particular ceremony that Thomas had ridden north to check the upper pasture fences and wouldn't be back until late afternoon. This was apparently normal. This was apparently just how Thomas Walker operated, present when he was needed, absent when the land required him, no announcement in either direction. She told herself she hadn't noticed the absence. She was a poor liar even to herself. She redirected that energy into work, which was something she had always been good at, and the work at Walker Ranch never ran short. That morning she had 3 patients waiting before she had finished her coffee. A young cowhand named Pete, with a badly wrapped blister on his heel that had been getting worse for a week because he'd been afraid to say anything. An older woman named Ruth, who cooked for the bunkhouse and had been having pain in her lower back, severe enough to affect her sleep, and a boy of about 9, who belonged to one of the ranch families and had fallen from a fence the previous afternoon, and was trying to pretend his arm wasn't bothering him because he didn't want to be in trouble. The arm was not broken, which was the good news. The blister was infected enough to require real attention. And Ruth's back pain was after careful questioning connected to the way she had been standing at the cooking fire for years. A small adjustment in how she positioned herself, combined with something Elizabeth improvised from materials she found in the supply room, would help significantly. You mean to say, I've been hurting myself all these years, and nobody told me, Ruth said. Nobody noticed, Elizabeth said. Or rather, people noticed you were hurting and accepted it as inevitable. It isn't. Ruth looked at her with an expression that contained several years of stoic suffering quietly reconsidered. "I'll be damned," Ruth said. "Probably not for this," Elizabeth said. Ruth laughed a surprised, genuine sound, and it carried across the yard, and two of the nearby workers looked up from what they were doing to see what Ruth was laughing about, because apparently, Ruth laughing was notable enough to warrant attention. Elizabeth filed that information away. She was beginning to understand the geography of this community. Who held what kind of weight? Where the trust pooled? How things worked in a place like this that had no formal structure beyond the practical rhythms of ranch life. Ruth was one of those people who held weight without titles. The workers' families trusted Ruth's judgment the way city people trusted institutions automatically and entirely. If Ruth trusted Elizabeth, it would matter. She made sure to take Ruth's situation seriously. She came back after lunch to check on the adjustment she'd suggested and ask how the back was feeling and whether Ruth had eaten properly, and she did this with the same attention she gave to the acute cases, because she understood that chronic pain that gets managed well stays manageable, and chronic pain that gets ignored becomes catastrophic. Ruth noticed. "You don't treat people like they're inconveniences," Ruth said. "They're not inconveniences," Elizabeth said. "Some doctors do," Ruth said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "I've worked with some of them." Ruth looked at her with sharp, measuring eyes. "That why you're out here instead of in some city hospital?" Elizabeth considered how much to say. "Partly," she said. Ruth nodded slowly, the way someone nods when they've understood more than you said. "Well, for what it's worth, these people needed someone who actually looks at them when they talk." It was not a small thing to say. Elizabeth received it as what it was. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. Thomas came back in the late afternoon as Henry had predicted, and Elizabeth was in the middle of redressing Pete's heel when she heard the horse in the yard, and a few minutes later, Thomas's voice at the other side of the building, brief quiet checking on something with one of his lead workers. She focused on what she was doing. Pete, 19 years old, and trying very hard not to show that having a woman treating his foot was making him self-conscious. Said, he rode out to the Hendersons this morning too. The family over the North Ridge. Their oldest boy's been sick. Elizabeth's hands stilled for a moment. "I didn't know that," she said. "Mr. Walker mentioned you to them last week," Pete said. "Figured you should know in case they send word." She finished the dressing and gave Pete his instructions, and then went to find Thomas. Not because she felt she needed to account to him for anything, but because she wanted to know about the Henderson family, and it was more efficient to ask directly. She found him at the water trough near the barn. He had his hat off, and was working the pump dusty from the ride, giving the distinct impression of a man who had covered a lot of ground since before daylight. "Pete tells me you visited the Hendersons this morning," she said. He looked up. Not startled, she was beginning to understand that Thomas Walker was not easily startled. "Their boy's been running a fever for 4 days," he said. "Mother's worried." "Why didn't you mention them to me? I didn't know if they'd want a stranger in. Some people out here—" He paused, measuring the words. "They have to come to the idea on their own. I planted the seed, told them about you, told them what you'd done for Jackson and for some of the families here." A beat. "I figured if they sent word, it meant they were ready." Elizabeth looked at him. "You've been doing that," she said. It wasn't a question. "Doing what?" "Talking about me. To people who might not come on their own." He met her eyes steadily. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it honestly. In another context in Chicago, from another person, it might have felt like someone managing her, placing her, deciding her usefulness on her behalf. But she understood in the way she was increasingly understanding Thomas Walker's particular way of doing things that this wasn't that. He wasn't managing her. He was clearing ground. "No," she said. "It's not a problem." "Good," he said. He put his hat back on and went to see to his horse, and Elizabeth stood there for a moment in the early evening light, recognizing that she was going to have to relearn some of her assumptions about what help looked like when it came from someone who wasn't using it to take something from you. The Henderson boy's name was Samuel, and he was 7 years old, and when Elizabeth arrived the next morning, she understood within the first 10 minutes of speaking with his mother Clara that the fever was not the only thing happening in that household. Clara Henderson was a woman of about 30, who had the careful, conserved movements of someone managing several difficult things at once and determined not to let any of them show. Her husband, a man named Frank, was working a section of land with a lien against it that was apparently causing significant stress, and she had 2 other children under 5, and Samuel had been sick for 4 days, and she was doing all of this with the particular focused exhaustion of someone who had decided that stopping was not an option. Elizabeth examined Samuel carefully. The fever was real and needed attention, but it was manageable, not the dangerous kind, the wearing kind, the kind that depleted a child and scared a parent unnecessarily, when the right treatment would have it down significantly within 48 hours. She explained exactly what was happening and exactly what she was going to do and exactly what Clara should watch for. Clara listened with the intensity of a woman who had been waiting for someone to speak to her in complete sentences. "Is he going to be all right?" Clara asked. "Yes," Elizabeth said with the certainty she reserved for things she was actually certain about. "He's going to be fine, but I want to come back in 2 days, and if he's worse before, then send someone for me immediately." "Mr. Walker said you came from Chicago," Clara said. "I did." "Why did you come all the way out here?" It was the straightforward kind of question children asked, delivered from an adult who had apparently decided that the straightforward version was the most honest. Elizabeth found she didn't mind it. "I needed a new beginning," she said. And this is where the beginning was. Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Frank's going to say we can't pay you properly," she said. "I want you to know beforehand, it's not because we don't value what you're doing. Pay me what you can," Elizabeth said. "That's all I ask." Clara nodded. Then, with the decisiveness of a woman who had made up her mind about something, "Stay for lunch. It's the least I can do." Elizabeth stayed. They ate together. Clara and Samuel and the 2 small ones, and Elizabeth and Clara, talked about the land and the work, and the way Frank had been before the financial troubles, and the way things were now, and Elizabeth listened, the way she had learned early in her nursing career, that listening was its own form of medicine. And by the time Elizabeth left, she understood that Samuel was not the only one in that household who had been needing attention. She made a note to come back sooner than 2 days, if she could manage it. It was Thomas who first told her about the situation with the land. Not that afternoon, not in a direct conversation. She learned it the way she was learning most things about the Walker Ranch community, through the accumulated context of many small moments. But that evening, when she found herself sitting near the fire in the main room of the ranch house where Thomas occasionally invited the senior workers in the evenings, for the practical reason that it was easier to have certain conversations there, she asked about the Hendersons, and Thomas told her about Frank Henderson's situation, with a directness that she had already come to expect from him. The land Frank Henderson farmed was subject to a lien held by a man named Whitmore, not a local man, but a city man, a businessman from Denver, who had apparently been acquiring liens and debts across the Wyoming territory in a pattern that several people in Willow Creek had noticed, and none of them had yet figured out what to do about. "He's been calling debts early," Thomas said. "Men who thought they had more time to pay. Frank's not the only one." "What does he want?" Elizabeth asked. "The land," Thomas said simply. "At least that's the working theory." "Is there proof?" "Not the kind that matters in a court." He was quiet for a moment. "Not yet." Elizabeth absorbed this. "How many families?" she asked. "In the valley directly affected 4 that I know of. Probably more I don't." "And what's being done?" He looked at her. "That's what we're trying to work out." She thought about the careful, conserved movements of Clara Henderson. The way Frank Henderson's name came into every conversation about the land, with a particular tone, not defeated, but strained, the tone of a man who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. "There are things that can be documented," Elizabeth said carefully. "Patterns that look different when they're written down and compared side by side." Thomas looked at her. "You sound like you've thought about this before," he said. She met his eyes. "I have some experience," she said, with the value of documented evidence. A silence passed between them that contained more information than either of them put into words. "The land records are public," Thomas said finally. "In town, the county office." "I know," Elizabeth said. "A person with a legitimate reason to be in the county office wouldn't raise any questions." "No," she said. "They wouldn't." He looked at her with the steadiness that she was beginning to understand was his version of confidence, not aggressive, not performative, just completely present. "You don't have to get involved in this," he said. "It's not your fight." "Someone once told me that about the doctor in Chicago," she said. "That it wasn't my fight. That I should look the other way and protect my position. And people died," she said. "Because I waited too long." Thomas was quiet. "I'm not going to wait this time," she said. He nodded. Just once. The way a man nods when he understands that a decision has been made and doesn't require his approval. "I'll ride into town with you tomorrow," he said. "If you want the company." "I can manage on my own," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I didn't offer because I thought you couldn't." She looked at him. He looked back with absolutely no indication of apology or modification. "Fine," she said. "You can come." And something in the air between them settled not toward anything named or admitted, but toward something warmer than it had been the day before, and slightly less defended than the day before that. The kind of incremental, careful movement that happens between two people who have both been hurt and are both very slowly deciding whether the ground beneath their feet is worth trusting. The county office in Willow Creek was managed by a man named Patterson, who was simultaneously flustered by Elizabeth's presence and completely unable to explain why, which she found mildly entertaining. Thomas stood at a distance that was close enough to be present and far enough not to be hovering, which she was beginning to suspect was a characteristic deliberate position of his. She asked for land records. Patterson gave them to her. She spent 2 hours going through documents at the table Patterson provided, and Thomas sat across from her and said almost nothing, which was exactly what she needed. He brought her coffee at some point without being asked which she drank, without commenting on which was its own form of conversation. What she found in the records was worse than Thomas had described, not because the individual facts were dramatic. Individually, they looked unremarkable liens filed at normal times calls made within legal parameters, nothing outwardly wrong in any single document. But the pattern was not subtle once you saw it. "He's waiting for specific conditions," Elizabeth said quietly to Thomas, not to the room. "Look, the liens are all called in clusters, not randomly. 3 within 6 weeks of each other, then quiet, then another cluster." She traced the dates with her finger. "He's waiting for something that makes multiple families vulnerable at the same time." Thomas leaned in to look. "Bad season," he said slowly. "Last winter was hard. A lot of people borrowed to get through it. So he waited until the debt was established," Elizabeth said, "and then he waited for the right moment to call it, when everyone's resources were already stretched." She sat back. "He knows exactly what he's doing." Thomas was looking at the records with an expression that was very controlled and very cold. "How many of these can we copy?" he asked. "All of them," she said. "They're public documents. We have every right to request copies." She requested copies. Patterson was helpful in the way of a man who sensed that something significant was happening and had decided that his best approach was to be quietly cooperative. They left with a folder that Elizabeth held with the particular care of someone who understood what she was holding. Riding back toward the ranch in the late afternoon, Thomas said, "What do we do with this?" "We document the rest," she said. "The stories that aren't in the official records. The conversations, the threats, the specific language used when the debts were called. I need to talk to the families." "They'll talk to you," Thomas said. "They already trust you." "Some of them," she said. "I need to earn the rest." A pause. "That thing you said yesterday," Thomas said. "About the doctor in Chicago. The evidence you kept." She waited. "Is there someone in Chicago who could use it? Someone with enough standing to actually do something?" She had thought about this. More than he knew. She had thought about it through several sleepless nights in Chicago and a few more in Wyoming. "There's a federal medical examiner," she said. "He was new to the board just before I left. He hadn't been part of the politics long enough to be compromised." A pause. "I wrote to him once. He didn't respond. But that was 8 months ago." "Write again," Thomas said. She looked at him. "Both matters," he said. "The doctor in Chicago and what's happening here. They're the same shape, Elizabeth. Someone with power using it to harm people who can't fight back and hoping no one looks closely enough to notice." She felt something shift when he said her name. Not the first time he'd used it a few times now, but with this particular weight behind it, this particular steadiness. "You're right," she said. "I know," he said. And there was something in the slight change of his voice that was almost wry, almost warm, and almost entirely unlike the closed-off man Mrs. Hadley had described. Almost. She wrote the letter that night. She wrote two, actually one to the federal medical examiner in Chicago, and one to a territorial attorney she had heard mentioned at Dr. Randall's office as someone who occasionally took cases of land fraud without charging what the cases were actually worth. She wrote both letters carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that a poorly written letter could undo everything a well-documented case had built. She cited specific dates, specific records, specific patterns. When she finished, she sat back and read them through once. Thomas knocked on the doorframe of her room. "Still at it," he said. Not a question. "Just finished," she said. He looked at the papers in front of her. "Can I read them?" She hesitated for just a moment, not because she didn't trust him, but because she had spent so long in a world where showing your work meant having it turned against you. Then she held the letters out. He read them both without interrupting, without touching them, just leaning slightly to read. "This is good," he said. "This is very good." "I know," she said. He almost smiled. The small version that she was cataloging involuntarily in some part of her mind that she had not given permission to start collecting things about Thomas Walker. "You're allowed to say thank you," she said. "Thank you," he said, "is what I say when someone does me a favor. This is what you do. It doesn't need my evaluation." She looked at him. "That's a very specific distinction," she said. "It's an accurate one," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. The fire in the main room was settling into coals. The ranch had gone quiet around them. Somewhere outside, an owl was moving through the dark. "Thomas," she said, and it was the first time she had used his name, without the formal prefix, without the distance. She had been careful to maintain, and she felt him register it just slightly, just a fractional change in his stillness. "What happened to your wife?" she asked. "If you want to tell me." A long silence. "Fever," he said. "The winter of '82. It came fast. There was nothing Randall could do, he told me afterward, that there was nothing anyone could have done. I know he believed that." A pause. "It took me a long time to believe it too." Elizabeth listened. "I blamed myself for a long time," Thomas said. "Thought I should have gotten help sooner. Thought I should have done something different. Thought—" He stopped. "You spend enough time thinking that way, and it starts to feel like the only honest response to losing someone. Like being okay is a betrayal." "It isn't," Elizabeth said quietly. "I know that now," he said. "Mostly." They were quiet. "I kept everyone at arm's length after that," he said. "Easier that way. And then I fell on your train platform," Elizabeth said. The almost smile again, fuller this time. "You fell on the station platform," he said. "My platform would imply I had some claim to the station." "Fine," she said. "The station platform." "And I happened to be there," he said. "You happened to be there," she agreed. They sat in the quiet for another moment, and then Thomas stood and said goodnight in the way he said most things, simply without decoration, and left. And Elizabeth sat alone with the letters she had written, and the fire burning down to almost nothing, and the understanding that something in her chest, in the tight, exhausted knot she had been carrying since Chicago, had loosened another fraction. Not enough to call it healed, but enough to feel the difference. The letter arrived from the county records office 6 days later. Not a response to anything she had sent. Her letters hadn't had nearly enough time to reach anyone yet. This was something else entirely. It arrived addressed to Thomas Walker via the general store, and he brought it to her because the content concerned her directly. She read it once, then again. Then she looked up at Thomas, who had waited with the quiet patience of a man who understood that some news needed a moment. "Whitmore filed a complaint," she said, "with the county, against me." Thomas was very still. "He says I've been practicing medicine without authorization," she said. "He's asking the county to prohibit me from treating patients in this territory." A silence. "He's here," she said. It wasn't a question. "Or someone working for him is." "No one in this county would have filed this without being asked," Thomas said. His voice was level, completely controlled, the kind of controlled that was actually more dangerous than anger. "He knows about me," Elizabeth said. "He found out I was here." "How?" She thought back through the past 3 weeks. The patients, the county office, Patterson and his cooperative helpfulness, the records they had copied. "The county office," she said. "Patterson must have mentioned us to someone." Thomas said nothing for a moment. "He moved fast," he said. "He always does," Elizabeth said. "That's how he operates. He doesn't wait for you to build your case. He preempts it." She felt the familiar coldness moving through her. Not panic, but the specific kind of chill that comes with recognizing an enemy's pattern the moment they execute it. "He did this in Chicago, too. The moment I started documenting his mistakes, he moved first. Filed his complaint before I could file mine." "What happened in Chicago?" Thomas asked. "I lost," she said, "because I wasn't ready." She looked at the letter in her hands. "I'm ready now," she said. Thomas looked at her. "What do you need?" he said. "Not what should we do. Not what are you going to do. What do you need, the specific, practical, real version of the question that a person asks when they intend to actually help." She thought about it. "I need every person I've treated in this territory to be willing to say what I did for them," she said. "In public, on record." "They will," Thomas said. "You can't know that." "I know these people," he said, "and I know what you've done for them." A pause. "Will you let me talk to them?" She thought about what it meant. About a woman who spent 10 years being talked about by men who decided her fate from conference rooms she wasn't invited into. About Thomas Walker, who had not once in 3 weeks tried to speak for her. "Talk to them," she said. "But tell them they speak for themselves. Not for me. Not on my behalf. For the truth of what happened to them." "That's what I was planning to say," Thomas said. She looked at him. He looked back with the same steady, undefended directness that had knocked her slightly off balance since the afternoon in the livery stable. Outside, the ranch was going on with its day horses and voices, and the rhythms of work that didn't stop because someone in a county office had filed a paper that was designed to undo everything she had built here. She folded the letter. She put it in her bag next to the evidence she had carried from Chicago, and she understood with a clarity that had nothing peaceful about it this time, and everything determined that Charles Whitmore had just made the mistake of coming after her in a place where she was no longer alone. The complaint moved faster than Elizabeth expected. By the following morning, the news had already reached 3 households in Willow Creek before she had finished her first patient of the day. That was the thing about small communities. Information didn't travel, it detonated. And by the time Elizabeth arrived at Dr. Randall's office that afternoon, the old physician was already waiting for her with the specific expression of a man who has received bad news and spent several hours deciding how to deliver it. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then apparently decided that arguing about furniture was not the most productive use of their time. "The county commissioner received Whitmore's complaint this morning. I've known Patterson for 15 years, and he told me directly the complaint came with documentation. Letters, records, affidavits from Chicago. Someone prepared this carefully." "I know," Elizabeth said. Randall studied her. "You know who filed it?" "Charles Whitmore," she said. "He was the senior physician at Memorial Hospital in Chicago. I reported him to the hospital board 2 years ago for falsifying patient records and concealing fatal medication errors." She kept her voice even. "He had me removed from my position. He followed me here." The silence in Randall's office was the kind that happens when an older man recalculates everything he thought he understood about a situation. "He followed you," Randall said slowly. "Not physically, but he has connections. And when I started pulling land records at the county office last week, I apparently drew enough attention that word reached someone who reached him." She paused. "Or he's been watching for exactly this kind of opportunity, and someone who knew my situation pointed him toward Wyoming." Randall was quiet for a long moment. "How bad is the complaint?" she asked. "Bad enough," he said. "He's claiming you've been practicing medicine without authorization, treating patients beyond nursing scope and potentially causing harm. He's attached statements from 3 Chicago physicians supporting his characterization of your conduct there." He hesitated. "He's also suggesting your presence here was not coincidental, that you came specifically to interfere with certain business interests in the territory." Elizabeth felt the cold move through her again, faster this time, more specific. "He knows about the land records," she said. "So it appears. How long do I have before the county acts?" "There's a hearing scheduled," Randall said. 12 days. 12 days. She breathed through the number. "And what's your position?" she asked. Randall looked at her directly. "My position," he said carefully, "is that in 31 years of practicing medicine in this territory, I have never once had a colleague who treated patients the way you treat them, who asked the questions you ask, who caught what you caught." He paused. "Henry's knee. Anderson's lungs. The Henderson boy. The pattern you found in those land records that I, with 31 years of living in this community, completely missed." Elizabeth held very still. "My position," Randall said, "is that this county would be significantly worse off without you, and I intend to say so at that hearing." She had not expected that. She was honest enough with herself to admit it. She had expected cautious neutrality from an old physician who had already told her he needed to be able to trust her competence. She had not expected this. "Thank you," she said, and this time she meant it without qualification. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Whitmore sent a personal representative. The man arrived this morning on the early stage from Cheyenne. His name is Gerald Fitch. He's an attorney apparently, and he's already been to the commissioner's office and the county clerk, and I'm told he's been asking questions in town since 10 o'clock this morning." Elizabeth absorbed this. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that aren't really questions," Randall said. "The kind where you already know what answer you want, and you're looking for someone who'll give it to you." She knew exactly what kind he meant. "Where is he now?" she asked. "As of an hour ago, the saloon," Randall said. "Though not for the reason most men go there. He's been meeting with people privately." She thought of the families she had treated, the people Thomas had talked to. She thought of Clara Henderson and her careful, conserved movements and the story about Frank's land. "I need to talk to Thomas," she said. "He's already in town," Randall said. "He came in about an hour after Fitch arrived, heard the same thing I heard and rode in from the ranch." A pause. "He's been at the commissioner's office asking to see the formal complaint." Something in her chest moved. She left Randall's office and walked toward the commissioner's building and found Thomas exactly where Randall had said, standing outside the commissioner's door, with the folded pages of the complaint in his hand, and an expression on his face that she had not seen before. Not anger, something colder and more deliberate than anger. "You've read it," she said. "Yes." He held it out to her. She read it standing in the street. It was thorough. It was well constructed. It used the language of concerned patient safety professional standards, the welfare of the community, in exactly the way that people used that language when they wanted to harm someone while appearing to protect someone else. Whitmore had been busy. "He has 3 affidavits from Chicago physicians," she said. "I noticed. All 3 of them were on the board that removed me from my position," she said. "They're not neutral witnesses. They're participants in the original decision." "Can you prove that?" "Yes," she said. "Because I kept the board minutes. I kept everything." Thomas looked at her. "Where are those records?" he said. "In my medical bag," she said. "I've been carrying them since Chicago." A pause. "Of course you have," he said. There was something in his voice, not quite amusement, not quite admiration, something that contained both, but was too serious for either. "I need to go through everything tonight," she said. "Match their affidavits to the board records. Build the counter-argument point by point." "All right," he said. "I also need to know what Fitch has been saying to people in town." "I can find that out," Thomas said. "Don't confront him," she said immediately. He looked at her. "I'm serious," she said. "Don't give him anything to use. He's here to create conflict. Any confrontation you have with him becomes a story that works in his favor." Thomas held her gaze for a moment. "I wasn't going to confront him," he said. "Good. I was going to have Henry talk to some people," he said. "Henry knows everyone in this valley. He doesn't need to ask obvious questions." Elizabeth thought about this. "That's fine," she said. "I know it is," he said. "That's why I planned it." She looked at him. He looked back. And for one moment in the middle of the worst morning she had experienced since arriving in Wyoming, she felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not relief, not safety, not the simple gratitude of someone being helped. Something more specific than any of those. The feeling of standing next to a person whose judgment she trusted, and knowing without requiring proof that the trust was not misplaced. "Let's go back to the ranch," she said. "I have a lot of work to do tonight." "Yes," Thomas said. "You do." They rode back in the late afternoon and said very little, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind that had nothing to prove. Gerald Fitch came to the ranch the next morning. Elizabeth was treating a ranch hand's infected hand when the sound of an unfamiliar horse brought several people to the yard, and she looked up from her work to see a man in a town suit dismounting at the gate with the deliberate manner of someone who had decided that the impression he made arriving mattered. How was about 50? Neat. The kind of neat that announced itself. He looked around the yard with an expression that managed to be politely contemptuous, taking in the ranch, the workers, the ordinary reality of a working cattle operation, and then he looked directly at Elizabeth. "Miss Morgan," he said. It was not a greeting, it was an identification. "Finish holding pressure on that," she told the ranch hand, guiding his other hand to the dressing. Then she straightened and looked at Fitch. "You'll want to wait until I'm done." Fitch waited. He was not pleased about waiting. He was very controlled about not showing that he was not pleased, which told her a great deal about him. When she finished and washed her hands at the basin, she turned to him fully. "You're Whitmore's representative," she said. "I'm an attorney authorized to handle certain matters on behalf of several Chicago interests," Fitch said smoothly, "including some that relate to your conduct here." "What do you want?" she asked. Not rudely, just directly. Fitch glanced around the yard. Two of the ranch hands had found reasons to be nearby. Ruth was visible in the doorway of the cookhouse. Thomas was standing near the barn 20 feet away, doing something with a piece of equipment with the studied casual concentration of a man who was absolutely listening. "Perhaps somewhere more private," Fitch said. "Anything you need to say to me can be said here," Elizabeth said. A slight pause. "Dr. Whitmore is prepared to withdraw the complaint," Fitch said, "and to provide a written statement to the county board affirming your nursing qualifications and character." Elizabeth looked at him. She waited. There was always a but. In exchange, Fitch said, "you would sign a statement acknowledging that your records from Chicago were incomplete and that your original complaint against Dr. Whitmore was based on a misunderstanding of the hospital's procedures. You would agree to cease any interference with legitimate business activities in this territory. And you would," he paused, "leave Willow Creek within 30 days. The yard was very quiet. Elizabeth heard every word clearly. She let the silence sit for a moment. "He's scared," she said. Fitch blinked. "I beg your pardon. Charles Whitmore," she said. "He's scared. Because if he wasn't scared, he wouldn't be offering to withdraw the complaint. He would just let the hearing proceed and trust his affidavits." She held Fitch's gaze. "But he knows what I have. He knows what the land records show. And he's been watching me work in this community for 3 weeks through whatever eyes he has here, and he knows that the people I've treated will show up at that hearing." She tilted her head slightly. "So he sent you to offer me a way out that's really a way out for him." Fitch's expression was very careful now. "Miss Morgan." "No," she said. "You haven't heard the full." "No," she said again. "I heard what you offered. I heard what it would cost, and the answer is no." She picked up her medical bag. "Tell Dr. Whitmore. I'll see him at the hearing." Fitch stood very still for a moment. "You're making a serious mistake," he said. His voice had changed. The smooth professional tone had a different edge under it now. "I've been told that before," Elizabeth said, "by people who turned out to be wrong." She walked back towards the main building. Behind her, she heard Fitch say to the yard in general to anyone who was listening, "The county commissioner has broad discretion in these matters, and Dr. Whitmore has significant connections at the territorial level." She stopped. She turned around. "Mr. Fitch," she said clearly, in the voice that carried across hospital wards and emergency rooms, and every space where she had needed to be heard. "Every person on this ranch has seen what I do. Not what's written about me. What I actually do." She looked at him steadily. "You can have all the connections at the territorial level you want. The people who will speak at that hearing will be speaking about reality. And reality has a way of being more persuasive than connections when the people listening are honest." Fitch got on his horse. He left without another word. The yard held its breath for about 4 seconds. Then Ruth said from the cookhouse doorway, "Well, that was something." A sound went through the yard, not quite laughter, but its close relative. The release of tension that has been held long enough to become physical. Thomas came and stood beside Elizabeth. "You could have taken the offer," he said quietly. "Started somewhere else. No hearing, no fight." "I know," she said. But he'd still be doing what he's doing," she said. "To the Hendersons, to every family whose land he wants. He'd have my silence, and he'd use it." She looked at the gate where Fitch had exited. "I didn't come all the way from Chicago to find my line in the sand, and then step back." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't think you had." Henry came back that evening with what he'd learned. Fitch had been busy. In the 3 days since arriving, he had spoken with the county commissioner twice, the county clerk, 2 members of the local business council, and this was the part that made Elizabeth's hands still when she heard it, the 3 families in the valley who were most directly affected by Whitmore's land strategy. The Hendersons, the Brewers, the Calloways. He told them that the hearing could be expanded, Henry said. That if certain matters about land record interference came up, it could implicate people who were involved in looking at those records. Elizabeth understood immediately. "He threatened them," she said. "Not in so many words," Henry said. But the meaning was clear enough. Thomas's jaw tightened. "He's trying to isolate her. Make sure the people who'd speak on her behalf are too scared to show up." "Did it work?" Elizabeth asked. Henry looked at her. "Frank Henderson told Fitch to get off his land," Henry said. "Those are the cleanest words I can use for what Frank actually said." Something loosened in Elizabeth's chest. "And the Brewers, the Calloways." "Scared," Henry said honestly. "Brewer's got 3 kids and the smallest margin. He's scared." A pause. "But he didn't say no. He said he needed to think." Elizabeth nodded. She thought about what Fitch had done, the specific elegance of it, which was the same approach she had seen Whitmore use in Chicago. Don't attack the central figure directly. Isolate them. Remove the support structure. Let them stand alone in the hearing room, with no one to corroborate them, and then watch the case collapse under its own weight. It had worked in Chicago. She was not going to let it work here. "I need to go see the Brewers," she said. "Tonight." "It's getting late," Henry said. "I know," she said. "That's why I need to go tonight, before he has more time to work on them." Thomas stood up. "I'll ride with you." She didn't argue. The Brewer household was a family of 5. Martin, his wife Dorothy, and 3 children ranging from 4 to 11. Martin Brewer was a man who looked like he had been weathered by about a decade more than his actual age suggested, and when Elizabeth and Thomas arrived at his door in the early evening, he opened it with the expression of a man who had been expecting something difficult and was not sure which difficult thing had arrived. "Miss Morgan," he said. Then with a nod, "Thomas." "Martin," Thomas said, "can we come in?" They sat at the kitchen table. Dorothy stayed near the stove, moving quietly in a way that said she was listening to everything. The children had been put to bed, or at least directed toward bed. Elizabeth did not open with the hearing. She opened with his youngest child. "Emma's ear," she said. "How is it?" Martin blinked. "Better," he said, slightly thrown. "A lot better, actually. Whatever you did." "Good," Elizabeth said. "I want to check it again before the week's out if you'll let me." She looked at him steadily. "Martin, Fitch came to see you." A pause. "He did," Martin said. "What did he tell you?" Martin shifted in his chair with the discomfort of a man who has been sitting on something heavy. "He said that if people got involved in the hearing, spoke up, gave statements, it could bring attention to some of the land record activity. That there might be questions about who had access to what." "He was threatening you," Elizabeth said. "Not harshly, just clearly." "It didn't feel like a threat exactly," Martin said. "It felt like information." "That's how it's designed to feel," Elizabeth said. "The information is meant to make you afraid, and the fear is meant to keep you quiet. So that at the hearing I stand alone, and my testimony stands against the testimony of 3 Chicago physicians, and the county commissioner makes the safest political decision, which is to side with the man who has connections at the territorial level." Dorothy turned from the stove. "And then what?" Dorothy asked. Elizabeth looked at her. "And then I leave," Elizabeth said. 30 days, which is what Fitch offered me this morning. And Whitmore continues acquiring land liens in this territory with no one watching him and no one documenting the pattern. And in 6 months or a year, Martin's lien gets called at a moment calculated to cause maximum difficulty. And the Hendersons, and the Calloways. The kitchen was very quiet. Martin's hands were flat on the table. "You can't know that," he said. But his voice said that he knew it was true. "I know the pattern," Elizabeth said. "I've been studying it for 2 weeks. The county records tell a very clear story when you lay the dates out in sequence." She reached into her bag and put the copied pages on the table. "Look." Martin looked. Dorothy came from the stove to look. Thomas, sitting across the table, said nothing. He had said almost nothing since they arrived, and she understood this was deliberate. This was Thomas. Understanding that this was her conversation, and standing in it with her without taking it from her. Martin studied the dates in silence for a long moment. "He's been planning this," Martin said finally. He sounded slightly stunned. "Yes," Elizabeth said. "For at least 2 years based on when the first liens were established. And if you leave—" "Then the person who identified the pattern is gone," Elizabeth said. "The documentation doesn't disappear, but the person who can explain it to a court is gone. And it's much harder to pursue a case without someone who understands the evidence." Martin looked up at her. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "A statement," she said. "Your account of Emma's treatment, and your account of the conversation with Fitch, in your own words, on record." She paused. "And your presence at the hearing if you're willing. Not to speak for me. To speak for the truth of what happened in your own household." Martin looked at Dorothy. Dorothy looked at him. "We could lose the land," Martin said quietly. Not to Elizabeth, to Dorothy. Having a conversation that had probably been happening between them since Fitch left. "We could lose it anyway," Dorothy said. Her voice was quiet and steady. "At a time he chooses, when it hurts the most." Martin was quiet. "Emma's ear," he said finally. "She'd been crying about it for 2 weeks before you came." He looked at Elizabeth. Dorothy had stopped sleeping properly because Emma was crying every night. Elizabeth waited. "All right," Martin said. "We'll come." The Calloways were harder. Robert Calloway was a man who had learned through a series of difficult years that hope was a thing you held carefully and released quickly to minimize the damage when it broke. He listened to Elizabeth for 20 minutes, and then sat in silence for long enough that she began to think he was going to say no. "My father lost his land in Missouri," Robert said finally. "To a man who operated exactly this way, legal on paper, wrong in every other sense." He looked at the table. My father never recovered. Not financially. Not in himself. A pause. I swore I wouldn't put my family through that. Robert, Elizabeth said carefully. The difference between what happened to your father and what's happening here is that no one saw the pattern before it was too late. Someone is seeing it now. The question is whether anyone stands with that person long enough to do something about it. Robert looked at her. You're asking me to trust that it'll be different this time, he said. No, she said. I'm asking you to trust the evidence, which is a different thing. She put the land record copies on his table, the same way she'd put them on Martin Brewer's. Look at this. Not at me. Look at this and tell me what you see. Robert looked. His wife sitting beside him looked. Thomas, standing quietly near the door, said nothing. Robert looked for a long time. He's waiting for harvest, Robert said quietly. Look at the timing. Every call comes just before or just after harvest, when cash flow is the tightest. Yes, Elizabeth said. He knows this land, Robert said. He knows how ranching works. He planned this around our seasons. Yes, Elizabeth said. Robert sat back. My father never had evidence, he said. Just his word against theirs. You have evidence, Elizabeth said. We have evidence. The question is whether we use it. Robert looked at Thomas. Thomas met his eyes. I've known you a long time, Robert, Thomas said. I'm not going to tell you what to do, but I'll tell you this. I've watched this woman work for 3 weeks, and I've never seen anyone fight harder for people who couldn't fight for themselves. A pause. She came to Wyoming with nothing. She's still here. She's still fighting. That's worth something. Robert looked at his wife. His wife looked at him. We'll be at the hearing, Robert said. Tate. They rode back to the ranch in the dark, and for a long while, neither of them said anything. The Wyoming night was enormous around them. The kind of enormous that made the distances between people feel both very large and somehow very small. You're good at this, Thomas said eventually. Not just the medicine, the other part. Talking to people, Elizabeth said. Believing in people enough to tell them the truth, he said. Most people dress the truth up, make it easier to swallow. You don't. The dressed-up version doesn't help anyone, she said. People know when they're being managed. They trust you less afterward. Where did you learn that? She thought about it honestly. My mother, she said. She was not a soft woman. She was not unkind, but she didn't soften things. She said that the people you love deserve the real version of the world, not the version you wish it was. A pause. She died when I was 14, but that part stayed with me. Thomas was quiet for a moment. She sounds like someone worth knowing, he said. She was, Elizabeth said. She would have liked Wyoming. What would she have made of you? He asked. The nurse, the fighter, the woman with evidence in her medical bag. Elizabeth almost laughed. Probably something like took you long enough, she said. She had very little patience for waiting when action was possible. Then she would have liked what you did today, Thomas said. The horses moved steadily through the dark. The stars overhead were the particular extravagance of stars that only appeared at this distance from any city, and Elizabeth had stopped being surprised by them and started instead being grateful for them. Thomas, she said. Yes. At the hearing, she said. I need you to let me lead it. He was quiet. I know you want to protect this, she said. I know that's not a small thing for you, but if you fight this battle, it becomes a dispute between you and Whitmore. If I fight it, it becomes what it actually is, the truth against a lie. She looked at him in the dark. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said. And then after a pause, it's hard. I know, she said. I'm not good at standing back when someone He stopped. The silence that followed had a specific quality. The horses walked. The stars were very bright. Someone you what? Elizabeth said carefully. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He was a man who chose his words with the same care he used for everything else, not because he was slow, but because he was precise. Someone who matters, he said finally, is in a fight. She let that sit. She did not push it further, but she held it the way you hold something fragile, carefully aware of what it is. "I'll stand back," Thomas said, "but I'll be there." "I know you will," she said. "That's enough." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and in 8 days there would be a hearing. And Elizabeth Morgan, who had arrived in Wyoming with nothing but a medical bag and a dead man's letter, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had learned the hard way that the truth did not defend itself, was finally for the first time in 2 years ready to let it. The 8 days before the hearing were the longest Elizabeth had known since the weeks in Chicago when she had sat in an empty apartment waiting to find out if the hospital board would destroy her publicly or simply quietly. The difference was that this time she was not sitting. She worked every hour the light allowed. She treated patients in the morning, compiled documents in the afternoon, and sat at the table in the ranch house long after everyone else had gone to bed, building the case with the systematic precision of someone who understood that a single gap in the evidence could be the gap that swallowed everything. Thomas brought her coffee at 10 o'clock every night without being asked. She never commented on this. He never made it a point. It simply happened the way certain things between two people begin to simply happen without negotiation, without announcement, settling into place, like something that had always meant to be there. On the third night, she looked up from her papers and found him sitting across the table rather than leaving after setting the cup down, which was new. "You should sleep," he said. "I will," she said, "after I finish cross-referencing the board minutes against Fitch's affidavits." "How much more?" "An hour. Maybe 2. He looked at the papers spread across the table. His reading was careful and slow. She had noticed that about him early, that he read everything thoroughly rather than quickly, and that what he retained afterward was precise. "The third affidavit," he said. "Dr. Harold Pryor." "Yes," she said. "He signed the board resolution removing me from my position, and then signed an affidavit claiming he had no involvement in the original complaint against Whitmore. Those two things can't both be true." "Can you prove that?" "The board minutes list every signatory," she said. "His name is on the resolution. The resolution explicitly references the original complaint. If he had no involvement in the complaint, he had no basis for signing the resolution." She looked up. "The affidavit is perjury. Not hard to prove, it just requires someone to look at 2 documents in the same room at the same time." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You've been building this for 2 years, he said. "Yes," she said. "Since before you left Chicago." "Since before I knew I was leaving," she said. "I started documenting the moment I realized the board wasn't going to act. I didn't know exactly what I was documenting for, but I knew I wasn't going to let it disappear." He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the one that wasn't quite readable, that sat somewhere between respect and something more personal that neither of them had named. "What was it like," he said, "carrying all that, alone?" She considered the question honestly, the way she always did with Thomas, because he asked honest questions and dishonest answers would have been an insult to that. "Heavy," she said. "And then after a while, just weight I was used to. The way you stop feeling the extra pounds in a bag you carry every day." She paused. "The worst part wasn't the weight. It was not knowing if it would ever matter, if all of it would amount to nothing." "It's going to matter," Thomas said. "You don't know that," she said. "No," he said. "But I know you. And I know the people in this valley. And I know Whitmore made a mistake." He leaned forward slightly. "He came after you in a place where you have real witnesses. Not papers, people. That's different from Chicago." She looked at him. "You really believe that?" she said. "Yes," he said simply. She turned back to her papers. But something in her shoulders had changed, a fraction less rigid, a fraction more settled. "Go to bed, Thomas," she said. "In a minute," he said. He stayed another half hour reading through documents she passed him when she needed a second set of eyes, and didn't say anything that wasn't useful, and finally left at close to midnight, and Elizabeth sat in the quiet afterward and thought about the fact that she had not been this unalone in years. The response from Chicago arrived on the 5th day. It came by telegraph to the Willow Creek station, addressed to her, and the station master sent it out to the ranch by way of young Pete, who delivered it with the solemn importance of someone who understood that the paper he was carrying mattered. Elizabeth read it in the yard. Her hands did not shake. She had trained them not to shake long ago. The telegraph was from the federal medical examiner she had written to. His name was James Howell, and his message was brief in the way of telegraphs, but its brevity contained something she had not allowed herself to hope for. Received letter. Records compelling. Forwarded to Federal Medical Oversight Board. Investigation opened. Please preserve all documentation. Will correspond further by post. J. Howell, Federal Medical Examiner, Chicago District. She read it twice. Then she sat down on a nearby water trough, because her legs made a unilateral decision that sitting was appropriate. Henry found her there 3 minutes later. "Miss Morgan." His voice was concerned. "You all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm fine." She looked up at him. "Where's Thomas?" "North fence. Back in an hour." "Tell him I need to speak with him when he gets back," she said. "It's not urgent, but tell him." Henry studied her face. "Good news or bad news?" he asked. She looked at the telegraph in her hand. "Good," she said. "Possibly very good." Henry's face did something complicated and warm. "I'll tell him." Thomas came back in 40 minutes rather than an hour, which told her Henry had used a tone that communicated more than the words. She showed him the telegraph. He read it. He read it again. "They opened an investigation," he said. "Yes," she said. "On Whitmore, in Chicago, for the original patient deaths." "Before the hearing here." "Yes." She understood what he was seeing. "It changes the weight of Whitmore's complaint against me. It doesn't nullify it. The county hearing will still happen. But it means his affidavits come from a man who is now under federal investigation. The commissioner can't ignore that." Thomas looked at her. "How did you know to write to Howell?" he said. "I didn't know," she said. There was a moment right after I arrived in Wyoming when I decided I was done waiting for the right moment. There is no right moment. There's only the moment you choose to act." He handed the telegraph back to her. "You chose to act 8 months ago," he said, "when you wrote the first letter." "And it didn't work then," she said. "And you wrote again," he said. She folded the telegraph carefully. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Elizabeth," he said. She looked at him. It still did something to her when he said her name with that particular weight. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Before the hearing. Before everything gets complicated." She waited. "When I found you at that station," he said, "I thought I was doing a practical thing, helping someone in a difficult situation, finding medical care for my ranch." He paused. "I told myself that for a while. It's easier to believe practical reasons for things than the real ones." She was very still. "The real reason," she said carefully, "the real reason," he said, "is that I watched you work for 30 seconds in that livery stable and understood you were someone I hadn't met before, not as a type, as a specific person." His voice was steady, completely steady. "And then you came to the ranch and proved it every single day. And I've been watching you fight for people who needed someone to fight for them, and He stopped. "I was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and he was not a man who said things before he was sure of them," and she understood that this pause was the pause of precision rather than hesitation. "I don't want you to leave Wyoming," he said. "Not because of the ranch, not because of the patients, because—" Another pause. "I haven't let myself want anything in 5 years. And I'm telling you this now because whatever happens at the hearing, I don't want you to not know it." Elizabeth looked at him. She had rehearsed in the abstract various responses to various things that might be said by various people. She had not rehearsed this. "Thomas," she said. And then because she was also a person who chose accuracy over comfort. "I haven't let myself want things either. I've been so focused on the fight for so long that I stopped distinguishing between the fight and the life." She held his gaze. "I don't want to leave Wyoming either." A silence. Not an empty one. The fullest kind. "After the hearing," Thomas said, After the hearing, she agreed. He nodded once. And then, because they were both people who understood that some things needed to be said, and then the world needed to continue being the world. I'll see to the horses. He walked toward the barn. Elizabeth stood in the yard and breathed the Wyoming air and understood that she was very much alive in a way she had not been in years. The night before the hearing, Fitch made one more move. Elizabeth was at Dr. Randall's office going through the final organization of her documents when Henry arrived at a pace that told her something had happened before he said a word. "Brewer," Henry said. "Fitch went to see Brewer again tonight. Martin came to find me an hour ago." Elizabeth straightened. "What did Fitch say?" "He told Martin that Whitmore had spoken to someone at the territorial governor's level. That if the hearing went badly for Whitmore's interests, certain land lien decisions might be accelerated, Martin's included." Henry's jaw was tight. "He's threatening him, directly this time. No more dressed-up information." Randall, who had been listening from across the room, made a sound of quiet fury. Elizabeth thought fast. "Where is Martin now?" "At his place, shaken. Dorothy sent word because Martin's gone quiet. That's how she knows he's thinking about backing down." "I need to go to him," Elizabeth said. "It's late," Henry said. "I know," she said. She was already putting papers in her bag. "Randall, is there anything in territorial law about threatening a witness before a county hearing?" Randall looked at her sharply. "It would constitute obstruction." "Would Patterson document it if Martin gave a formal statement tonight?" Randall's eyes narrowed. "Patterson goes home at 7, but the commissioner himself lives on Oak Street, and I have known him for 20 years, and he owes me considerably more than a late-night conversation." Elizabeth looked at him. "Can you get him?" she said. "Give me 20 minutes, Randall said. She gave him 15. Martin Brewer was sitting at his kitchen table when Elizabeth arrived. Dorothy opened the door, and her expression said everything. The relief of someone who had been hoping someone would come, and the fear of someone who wasn't sure. Her hope was still a useful thing to feel. Martin looked up when Elizabeth came in. His face was the face of a man standing at a dividing line. She sat down across from him. She didn't soften it. "He threatened you," she said. "He said it wasn't a threat," Martin said. "He said he was providing information about how business decisions sometimes get made." "Martin," she said, "look at me." He looked at her. "That is a threat," she said. "And it is also obstruction of a county proceeding. And there is a way to use that right now tonight that changes the entire landscape of tomorrow's hearing. But I need you to be willing to say what happened to the county commissioner in the next hour." Martin stared at her. "The commissioner," he said. "Dr. Randall is bringing him here," she said. "Right now, if you're willing." "Randall's coming here," Dorothy said from the doorway. "Yes." Dorothy looked at Martin with the expression of a woman who had made up her mind and was waiting for her husband to make up his. Martin's hands were on the table. Elizabeth could see them tighten knuckle by knuckle into something resolute. "What do I say?" Martin asked. "Exactly what happened," Elizabeth said. "Exactly what Fitch said, and when and how he said it. Nothing more, nothing less. The truth, Martin. Just the truth." He let out a long breath. "All right," he said. Randall arrived with Commissioner Gerald Hughes 12 minutes later. Hughes was a man of about 60, who had the permanent skeptical expression of someone who had been dealing with the frontier's particular brand of complicated for most of his adult life. He sat at Martin Brewer's kitchen table and listened without interrupting while Martin told him in precise and careful detail everything Fitch had said. When Martin finished, Hughes was quiet for a moment. "The threatening of a witness before a county proceeding," Hughes said to no one in particular, "is a matter I take seriously." "As it should be," Randall said. Hughes looked at Elizabeth. "Miss Morgan, I want you to understand that tomorrow's hearing is still a legitimate proceeding. I can't dismiss the complaint based on Whitmore's behavior tonight." "I'm not asking you to," Elizabeth said. "I'm asking you to understand the full picture of what this complaint represents, and to consider that a man who threatens witnesses before a hearing might also have other methods of ensuring outcomes." Hughes looked at her for a long moment. "I'll be reviewing the procedural conduct of this complaint carefully," he said. "I want that noted." He left at close to 10 o'clock. Elizabeth stayed with the Brewers another 30 minutes. When she finally stood to go, Dorothy caught her hand. "Thank you," Dorothy said. "Thank Martin," Elizabeth said. "He's the one who spoke." Martin was looking at her with an expression she recognized, the particular look of someone who has done a hard thing and found on the other side of it that they feel more like themselves than they did before. "We'll be there tomorrow," he said. "Both of us." The hearing room was the largest interior space in Willow Creek, which was the back room of the county commissioner's building, and by 8 in the morning it was already more than full. Elizabeth stood at the front and counted faces. Every ranch hand from Walker's spread, who wasn't needed for critical morning work. Ruth in her good dress, sitting with her arms folded and her chin slightly raised. Henry in the second row. Jackson, the young man whose hand she had treated the first week, now completely healed, flexing the fingers that could have been lost. The Henderson family. Clara with Samuel, who was healthy and clear-eyed. Frank standing straight with the particular dignity of a man who has decided to stop being afraid. The Calloways. The Brewers. Martin and Dorothy side by side. Martin, with the expression of someone who has crossed a line and is standing firmly on the new side. Dr. Randall sat at the table beside Elizabeth. At the opposite table sat Fitch and 2 other men she didn't know, representing Whitmore's interests. Whitmore himself was not present. That she noted was information. Commissioner Hughes opened the proceeding with the formal language of county process, which Elizabeth half listened to while watching Fitch read the room. She saw the moment he counted the faces. She saw his expression make a very small, very controlled adjustment. Good, she thought. Let him adjust. The complaint was read aloud. Elizabeth listened to every word with the specific focus she used in emergency situations, not reacting, just receiving, building the complete picture. Then it was her turn. She stood. She did not look at Thomas, who was standing at the back of the room because there had been no more seats. She had asked him to be there, and he was there, and that was enough. "Commissioner Hughes," she said, "I'd like to begin not with myself, but with the people in this room." Hughes looked up from his papers. "Every person sitting in these seats has received medical care from me in the past 5 weeks, she said. Not one of them was turned away. Not one of them was charged beyond what they could afford. Not one of them was told that their suffering was inevitable when it wasn't. She paused. "I'd like to call Dr. Randall as the first witness." Randall spoke for 12 minutes. He spoke in the careful, precise language of a man with 31 years of medical practice behind him, and he described every case he had reviewed that Elizabeth had treated, and he described what she had caught that he had not, and he described the quality of her documentation, and he ended with a statement so direct that the room was completely silent afterward. "In 31 years," Randall said, "I have not had a colleague whose judgment I trusted more completely. And I have not encountered a situation where a complaint more clearly served the interests of the complainant rather than the community it claimed to protect." Fitch objected. Hughes overruled it. Then the patients spoke. Not all of them. Elizabeth had not asked all of them. She had asked the ones whose cases were clearest, whose testimony was most specific, whose experiences could not be dismissed as vague gratitude. Jackson stood and described the hand that could have cost him the ability to work. He held it up. He flexed every finger. He said quietly and without drama that Miss Morgan had treated him like his pain mattered when he'd been told by everyone else that he was being soft about a work injury. Clara Henderson described Samuel's fever and the specific instructions Elizabeth had given, and the fact that she had come back to check without being asked. Martin Brewer described Emma's ear infection, and then his voice steady, his eyes on Hughes, described in complete detail the visit from Gerald Fitch and the words Fitch had used. He delivered it with the careful precision of someone who has rehearsed accuracy rather than effect. Fitch was on his feet before Martin finished. "Objection, this is entirely irrelevant to—" "Sit down," Hughes said. The room was very quiet. Fitch sat. Then Elizabeth put the documents on the table. She went through them methodically. The Chicago board minutes. The affidavits from Whitmore's physicians, set beside the board records that proved their claimed non-involvement, was impossible. The land records from the county office with the pattern of clustered calls laid out in sequence. The Federal Telegraph from James Howell. She saved the telegraph for last. When she read it aloud, she heard the murmur go through the room, not loud, but real. The particular sound of people recalibrating what they understood about the situation. Fitch was speaking quietly to his associates. Hughes was looking at the telegraph. The federal medical examiner in Chicago, Hughes said, has opened an investigation into Dr. Charles Whitmore. Yes, Elizabeth said, based on documentation you provided. Based on documentation I have maintained for 2 years, she said, which I brought with me from Chicago because I understood it was too important to leave behind. Hughes looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Fitch. Mr. Fitch, he said, in light of the federal investigation now on record, and in light of the testimony regarding your conduct with a hearing witness, I have a specific question. Was this complaint filed with the intent of suppressing Miss Morgan's activity as it related to land record documentation in this territory? Fitch's voice was smooth. The complaint was filed entirely on the basis of professional. Answer the question, Hughes said, not the question you prefer. A silence. Fitch said nothing. That Elizabeth thought was also information, and everyone in the room received it. The recess lasted 45 minutes. Elizabeth sat in the hallway outside the hearing room and did not pace. She had learned early in her career that pacing communicated anxiety to the people watching, and she was always aware of the people watching. Ruth came and sat beside her. How do you think it went? Ruth asked. I don't know, Elizabeth said honestly. I've done everything I could do. What happens now is up to Hughes. He's a fair man, Ruth said. Most people are, Elizabeth said, when the stakes are clear enough. Ruth looked at her with the sharp, measuring eyes that Elizabeth had come to deeply respect. You know what I noticed, Ruth said. When you were up there talking, you never once looked scared. I was scared, Elizabeth said. I know, Ruth said. That's what I mean. You were scared and you did it anyway. That's what these people needed to see. A pause. They needed to see that it was possible. Elizabeth absorbed this. Thomas came out of the hearing room and stood near her, not crowding, just present. Fitch's associates left the building, he said quietly. 15 minutes ago. Elizabeth looked at him. Both of them, she said. Both of them, he said, took their papers. She understood what that meant. Men hired to support a position did not leave before the verdict unless they understood that the position had already collapsed. He's going to withdraw, she said. Thomas said nothing. Whitmore, she said. Fitch is going to recommend he withdraw the complaint before Hughes rules, because a ruling against them goes on record. A withdrawal can be spun as a strategic decision, Thomas said. Yes, she said. He's going to try to make it look like a choice. Thomas looked at her. Does that matter? He said. If the outcome is the same. She thought about it. The land fraud matters, she said. The withdrawal doesn't close the investigation into Whitmore, but the land fraud, the county record evidence that needs to go to the territorial level. A withdrawal just makes it slightly harder to use the hearing as a vehicle for that. I've already been in contact with the territorial attorney, Thomas said. She looked at him sharply. When? 3 days ago, he said. After you wrote your letters. I wrote one of my own. He met her eyes steadily. I said I wasn't going to be involved. I should have been more specific about what kind of involvement I meant. She stared at him. You contacted the territorial attorney, she said. Yes. Without telling me. Yes, he said. And then, I didn't do it for the hearing. I did it for the families, for Frank Henderson and Martin Brewer and the Callaways. The land fraud case is separate from your case, and it needed someone who was focused on that specifically. A pause. I should have told you. She was quiet for a moment. She was genuinely quiet, not composing a response, actually sitting with the information. You were protecting the thing I couldn't focus on while I was focused on this, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He almost smiled. "You say thank you when someone does you a favor." "Yes," she said. "I do." The door to the hearing room opened. Hughes's clerk appeared. "The commissioner is ready," he said. Fitch moved to withdraw the complaint before Hughes could open his mouth. He did it smoothly, professionally, in the language of reconsideration rather than defeat. Elizabeth watched him deliver it and understood that he was very good at his job, that the job in this case had simply been in service of the wrong thing. Hughes accepted the withdrawal. And then he did something Elizabeth had not expected. "Before this proceeding closes," Hughes said, "I want to place several things on the formal record. First, the testimony given today regarding the pattern of land lien activity in this territory is noted and will be transmitted to the appropriate territorial authorities as a matter of county concern." He looked directly at Fitch. "Second, the conduct described by Mr. Martin Brewer regarding pre-hearing communications will be reviewed for potential obstruction. I trust that the relevant parties understand the implications of that review." Fitch's expression did not change. His hands tightened slightly. "Third," Hughes said, and his voice shifted, became less formal, more direct. The voice of a man who had been the county commissioner of Willow Creek for 16 years and was going to say what he thought. "Miss Morgan, you came to this territory with nothing but your skill and your intention to serve. What this community has received from you in 5 weeks is not in question. What was in question was the process by which you operated, and that question has been answered to my satisfaction." He paused. "I'd like to see a formal arrangement that allows you to continue your work here with appropriate documentation. I'm prepared to assist in establishing that if you're willing." The room was quiet. Elizabeth stood. "I'm willing," she said. And then Ruth started clapping. It was not a large dramatic wave of applause. It was the small real kind, person by person, starting with Ruth and moving through the room with the unstoppable momentum of something that had been building for a long time and was finally allowed to be what it was. Jackson was clapping with the hand that could have been lost. Frank Henderson was clapping with the careful deliberateness of a man doing something he was not entirely used to doing. Martin Brewer was clapping, and Dorothy had her face turned slightly away, in the way people turn away when they don't want others to see their expression. Elizabeth stood at the front of the room and let it happen, and did not tell herself not to feel it. She turned and found Thomas at the back. He was not clapping. He was looking at her with the same expression she had first catalogued in the livery stable, the one that wasn't judgment and wasn't familiarity, and had been. She understood now something else entirely from the very beginning. Something he had been careful about. Something he had been honest about only once the night before, because he was a man who waited until he was sure before he said the real thing. She looked back at him, and he gave her the smallest nod, the private language they had been building between them for 5 weeks without either of them naming it, and she received it and held it as what it was. The room was still going around her. But in that moment, everything that mattered was very still. She had come to Wyoming with nothing but a medical bag and a dead man's letter. She was still here, and for the first time in 2 years, she understood that this was not the end of something. It was exactly where she was supposed to be. The withdrawal of the complaint did not mean the fight was over. Elizabeth understood this the moment the room emptied, and the immediate relief of the verdict settled into something more complicated. Fitch left Willow Creek on the afternoon stage without speaking to anyone. The 2 associates who had walked out early were already gone, and Charles Whitmore, who had never set foot in Wyoming territory at all, remained exactly where he had always been in Chicago, with his connections, and his carefully maintained reputation, and his federal investigation, now building quietly around him like a tide coming in that he could not yet see. The land fraud case was different, slower, the kind of legal machinery that moved in months rather than days. Thomas told her about the territorial attorney's response. The evening after the hearing, sitting at the main table in the ranch house with the fire going and the papers from the county spread between them. "He's interested," Thomas said. "More than interested. He's seen patterns like this before in other territories, and he's been looking for a case with solid documentation." He put the attorney's letter in front of her. "He wants to come to Willow Creek in 3 weeks." Elizabeth read the letter. I wants the families to be present, she said. Yes. The Hendersons, the Brewers, the Callaways, and anyone else who's been affected, Thomas said. He thinks there may be more than we identified. He wants to do a full canvass of the valley. Elizabeth set the letter down. She thought about Frank Henderson standing straight in the hearing room with his wife beside him. She thought about Martin Brewer and the way his hands had tightened on the table before he spoke. She thought about Robert Calloway saying my father never had evidence. They'll come, she said. I know, Thomas said. This is going to take a long time, she said. The land case. Months, possibly longer. Yes, Thomas said. She looked at him. You're not worried about that, she said. It was not a question. No, he said. Why not? He looked at her with the steadiness that she had stopped trying to interpret and started simply trusting. Because long cases require someone to keep them moving. Someone who pays attention to details and doesn't let things slip through. Someone who doesn't stop when it gets difficult. A pause. I've been watching you for 5 weeks, Elizabeth. I'm not worried about the long version of anything that has you involved. She held his gaze. That, she said, might be the most complete thing you've ever said to me. He almost smiled. I have my moments. She looked back at the papers. I need to write to Howell again, she said. The federal investigation and the territorial case may be able to support each other. If Whitmore's financial connections in Chicago run parallel to his land strategy in Wyoming, she was already reaching for paper. They might be the same operation at different scales. Thomas watched her begin to write. You know, he said, most people after winning a hearing would take at least one evening to simply, I'll rest when he's accountable, she said. A pause. Fair enough, Thomas said. He brought her coffee without being asked. She did not comment on this. He did not make it a point. 3 days after the hearing, the first unexpected thing happened. Dr. Randall came to the ranch in this morning, not for a patient, but for Elizabeth specifically, and his expression when he arrived was one she had not seen on him before, a combination of professional satisfaction and something almost like excitement, which sat unusually on the face of a man who had spent 31 years cultivating careful restraint. I received a letter this morning, he said. From the Wyoming Territorial Medical Association. Elizabeth looked at him. They've been following the Whitmore situation, he said, through their contacts in Chicago. Apparently, Howell's investigation has been generating attention in medical circles, people who knew about the original complaint against Whitmore and had their own concerns. He held the letter out. They're convening a formal review of the standards for nursing practice in the territory. They want a representative from Willow Creek to participate. She took the letter and read it. They want you, Randall said when she reached the relevant section, by name. She read her name in the letter, Miss Elizabeth Morgan, whose recent case in Willow Creek has demonstrated both exceptional competence and a commitment to community-level care that we believe represents a model for frontier medical practice, and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not pride exactly. Something quieter and more solid than pride. They're citing your case as a model, Randall said. My case nearly ended my ability to practice in this territory, she said. Your case demonstrated that nursing practice at the frontier level requires clearer formal protections, Randall said. There's a difference between the event and what the event teaches people. He looked at her over his glasses. You changed something, Elizabeth. Not just in Willow Creek. The way they're talking about it, it's larger than that. She sat with this information for a moment. Will you participate in the review? She asked. If I go, I'd want your involvement. Your 31 years carry weight they need to hear. I intend to, Randall said. I'm not so old that I can't ride to Cheyenne when it matters. He paused. Though I'd appreciate it if you drove rather than made me on horseback. She almost laughed. I'll see what I can arrange, she said. After Randall left, she sat alone for a few minutes. She thought about Harold Briggs, the dead man, whose letter had brought her here, the letter that promised a beginning and delivered something entirely different from what either of them could have imagined. She thought about the cold platform and the empty station and the medical bag splitting open and everything she had scattered across the boards of a Wyoming train station at the end of her ability to carry it alone. She thought about a pair of strong hands catching her before she reached the ground, and she thought about what Thomas had said the night before the hearing. "I've been watching you fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves," and understood that the fighting had turned into something she had not been fighting for at all. Something that had grown up between the fights in the small hours, and the evening conversations, and the coffee brought without comment, and the silences that held more than most people's words. She went to find Thomas. I was working near the barn, with two of the hands on a section of tack that needed replacing. He looked up when she came, and something in his face shifted immediately. Not alarm, the opposite. The specific readiness he had whenever she came to him with something. "Randall came," she said. "I know," Thomas said. "I saw him arrive." He said something brief to the two hands who found other things to do with the natural discretion of people who had spent 5 weeks watching something develop between two people and had collectively decided to be courteous about it. She told him about the letter, about the Territorial Medical Association, about the review. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Cheyenne." "For the review, yes," she said. "How long?" "I don't know yet. A week, perhaps more." He was quiet for a moment. "But you're coming back," he said. It was not phrased as a question, but it was asking something. "Yes," she said. "I'm coming back." He looked at her. She had not said "I want to come back," or "I plan to come back," or any of the careful formulations that left room between the words. She had said it the way she said the things she was certain of, simply directly as a fact. Thomas received it the same way he received everything she said, directly, completely. "Good," he said. She looked at him, at the scar on his left hand, and the way he held his shoulders, and the specific quality of his attention that had been trained on her since the livery stable, through every difficult conversation, and every evening on the step, and every cup of coffee brought in the late hours when she was still working. "Thomas," she said. "Yes. I need to say something, and I need you to not respond until I've finished saying it," she said. "All right," he said. "I came here with nothing," she said. "And I don't mean that the way people usually mean it when they say it. I mean it in the specific, actual sense. I had $4 and an 11-pound bag, and a letter from a dead man, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has run out of everything except the will to keep moving." She looked at him steadily. "I was not looking for anything except the next thing to do. I was not open to anything except work. I had spent 2 years closing every door between myself and the parts of life that weren't the fight, because the fight was all I had, and I needed it to be enough. I was listening, completely." "It wasn't enough," she said. "It was necessary. I'm not saying it wasn't necessary, but it wasn't enough, and I didn't know that until I stopped being alone in it." She paused. "You gave me a place, not charity. You were very specific about that, and I understood what you were telling me when you made that distinction. You gave me work, and in giving me work, you gave me something to stand on. And then you stood beside me without ever standing in front of me." A pause. "No one has done that before," she said. "Not once in 10 years of fighting. And I'm telling you this because after the hearing and Cheyenne and everything that's still ahead, I want you to know what it means, what you mean." She stopped. "You can respond now." Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I built a wall after Anna died. I want you to know that. I wasn't gradual about it. I didn't slowly become closed. I made a deliberate decision to close because the alternative felt like something I couldn't survive twice." He looked at her with the full directness she had come to understand was the most honest thing about him. "You didn't knock the wall down. You didn't push through it. You just were yourself every day, and the wall stopped making sense." Another pause. "I don't have the words for what that's like after 5 years of it making perfect sense." She looked at him. "I think," she said, "the word might be terrifying." "Yes," he said. "Exactly that. And also, yes," he said, "also that." She stepped forward, and he met her halfway, and for a moment they simply held on, not dramatically, not with the theatrical collapse of people in stories who fall into each other's arms. The real version, which was two people who had each learned to hold themselves together alone. discovering that holding together was different with someone else present. He was solid. She had known he would be. She discovered, exactly solid enough for him. After Cheyenne, she said against his shoulder. After Cheyenne, he said. They stayed like that for a moment. Outside the barn, the ranch went on the ordinary sounds of a working day. Horses and voices, and the rhythms that did not stop for any two people's private reckonings. That was all right. The world continuing was exactly what they needed it to do. The territorial attorney arrived in Willow Creek 17 days later as promised. His name was Daniel Marsh, and he was younger than Elizabeth had expected. Mid-30s, sharp-eyed with the quality of focused attention that distinguished people who had decided their work was not just work. He spent 2 full days in the valley. He met with the Henderson family, the Brewers, the Callaways, and 5 other families that the canvas had surfaced families who had not yet been directly threatened, but whose lien structures followed the same pattern, placed at the same calculated intervals. He sat at Thomas's table each evening, going through the land records Elizabeth had compiled, and asking questions with the precision of someone who already understood most of the answers and was verifying the gaps. On the second evening, he put down the last of the documents and said, "This is a comprehensive case." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "The pattern is clear." He looked at her. "The question is going to be establishing intent, that Whitmore or whoever he's working with, because I don't believe this is one man alone specifically designed the lien structure to drive these families off their land." "The clustering," Elizabeth said. "The seasonal timing. The fact that the lien terms were structured to be unworkable under normal harvest conditions, those aren't accidents." "No," Marsh said. "They're not. But in court we'll need someone who can explain that clearly to people who don't have your grasp of the document pattern." "I'll be there," Elizabeth said. Marsh looked at her. "This could go on for a year or more," he said. "It may require multiple appearances. The other side will attempt to complicate the evidence." "Mr. Marsh," Elizabeth said, "I carried 2 years of evidence in a medical bag across 3 states. I will be there." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Thomas. Thomas's expression communicated without words that Marsh could consider this matter settled. Marsh almost smiled. "All right," he said. "Then we have a case." The letter from Chicago arrived 6 weeks after the hearing. It came by post, thick and official, addressed to Miss Elizabeth Morgan, care of Walker Ranch, Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. The return address was the office of the Federal Medical Oversight Board, Chicago District. Elizabeth read it at the kitchen table while Thomas poured coffee on the other side of the room and did not pretend not to be listening. She read it twice. Then she set it down. "Whitmore has been suspended from medical practice," she said, "pending a full federal investigation into patient deaths at Memorial Hospital between 1882 and 1884. Thomas turned. She looked at the letter. "The board is citing new evidence as the basis for reopening 3 cases that were previously closed," she said. "Cases involving medication errors that resulted in patient deaths." She paused. "The deaths I reported 2 years ago." She stopped speaking. Thomas came and sat across from her and said nothing, because he understood that this moment was not one that needed filling. She sat with 2 years of it, the fighting and the losing and the empty apartment and the $4.30 and the dead man's letter and the cold platform and the bag splitting open. She sat with all of it and let it be what it was, real and hard and over and worth every single step of it. "They're calling it a landmark disciplinary case," she said finally. "Howell writes that it's the first time a nurse's documented evidence has been the primary basis for a federal medical investigation at this level." A pause. "The first time," Thomas said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with the full weight of everything he understood about what she had done and what it had cost her. "Anna died in 1882, he said quietly. Elizabeth went very still. He had not spoken Anna's name to her before. Not directly, not in connection to anything specific. "The winter of 1882, he said. "I told you that." His voice was careful. "She had a fever. Randall said there was nothing to be done. I believed him." A pause. "I've been believing him for 4 years." Elizabeth looked at him. "Thomas, I'm not saying it was Whitmore, he said quickly, firmly. I don't know that. I have no way of knowing that. He looked at the letter. But the cases they're reopening, 1882 and 1884, and the medication errors. He stopped. The silence was enormous. Elizabeth reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked down at her hand. Then he turned his palm up and held it. I'm not saying it was him, he said again. His voice was steady, but it was the steadiness of a man holding something very carefully. I know, she said. But if there's a chance, then the investigation will find it, she said. Howell is thorough. Marsh is thorough. And I will not let it be buried. She held his hand. I promise you that. He was quiet for a long moment. You came to Wyoming with evidence that might... He stopped. I didn't know, she said. I had no way of knowing. She looked at him directly. But I'm glad I kept it. And I'm glad I came. And whatever the investigation finds, it will be the truth. Not a version of it. The truth. He nodded. He did not speak for several minutes. Outside the ranch was moving through its morning. Henry's voice carrying across the yard. Pete doing something with considerably more noise than necessary. The regular rhythms of a place that had become, without her planning it, the most real place she had ever lived. Elizabeth, Thomas said finally. Yes. He looked at her with the directness that was the most honest thing about him, undecorated, unguarded, the real version. I want to ask you something, he said. And I need you to tell me if the timing is wrong, because I know there's a lot still ahead. The land case, Cheyenne, Chicago, and whatever comes from the investigation, and your work here, and with Randall, and with the Territorial Association. I know all of that. She waited. Stay, he said. Not because you have nowhere else to go, not because the work requires it, but because... He stopped and chose the real words. Because this is where you belong. And because I would like to spend the rest of my life watching you fight for people who need someone in their corner. And being in yours. A pause. If you want that. She looked at him. She thought of her mother's voice took you long enough and almost smiled. Yes, she said. Just that. The same way she said the things she was certain of. He let out a breath that she understood had been held for longer than this conversation. Yes, he said back. Not a question. An agreement. She looked at their hands on the table. There's still a lot of work, she said. I know, he said. The land case isn't resolved. I know. The investigation in Chicago could take another year. I know that too, he said. And I'm going to be difficult about the Territorial Association review because I have strong opinions about the standards they're proposing. He almost smiled, the full version, the one that changed his face completely. I expect nothing less, he said. She squeezed his hand once, and then let go and picked up the letter from Howell, because there were responses to be written, and cases to be built, and work that did not stop, because two people had said the real things to each other. Thomas got up and refilled the coffee, and the morning continued. What followed was not a simple story. The territorial land fraud case took 14 months. Daniel Marsh was thorough and persistent, and he had the documented pattern Elizabeth had built, and the testimony of 7 families, and in the end, a ruling that invalidated 6 of Whitmore's lien structures as fraudulently engineered. Frank Henderson kept his land. Martin Brewer kept his. The Calloways stayed. The 5 other families who had been quietly waiting for the tide to reach them watched it recede instead. Robert Calloway, at the conclusion of the case, stood outside the courthouse in Cheyenne and said with the measured precision of a man who had once told her his father never had evidence, "I want you to know, it made the difference, all of it." Elizabeth told him she knew. The federal investigation in Chicago reached its conclusion in the spring of 1888. Charles Whitmore was permanently revoked of his medical license and barred from practice in any state that recognized the federal board's jurisdiction. 3 of his former colleagues at Memorial Hospital were censured. The cases of the patients who had died under his care in 1882 and 1884 were formally reopened and their records corrected. Among the 1882 cases was a woman named Anna Walker of Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. Elizabeth was in Chicago when the final report came through. She read it alone first in the small room at the boarding house where she was staying, and she sat with it for a long time before she picked up paper and wrote to Thomas. She wrote carefully. She told him exactly what the report said, and what it meant, and what it did not mean, and what they would never be able to know with certainty. She did not soften any of it. She told him that his faith in Randall had not been misplaced. Randall had done everything in his power. The errors were Whitmore's in the medication records, in the treatment decisions made remotely through a correspondence system that Whitmore had used to collect fees from frontier physicians without providing adequate care. She told him that he had been right to grieve, that Anna's death had not been inevitable, that his instinct, the one he had suppressed for 5 years because Randall was a good man, and he trusted good men, had not been wrong. She told him she was coming home. His letter arrived by the time she was 2 days from Willow Creek. Brief as his letters always were, in the precise language of a man who chose every word with the same care he gave everything. Come home, Elizabeth. Everything here is waiting. I am waiting. Take as long as you need, and then come home. She arrived at Willow Creek Station in November of 1888. There was no empty platform. Thomas was there. Henry was there. Ruth in her good coat. Pete trying to look casual and failing entirely. Jackson with both hands whole and working. Clara Henderson with Samuel, who was 8 years old now and healthy and watching everything with the bright attention of a child who has grown up in a place where things happen. She stepped off the train with her medical bag, the same one repaired twice, the leather worn soft with use, and Thomas walked to her through the small crowd, the way he did everything without ceremony, without performance, just directly and with complete intention. He took the bag from her hand. "How was Chicago?" he said. "Cold," she said. "And done." "Done," he repeated. "Done," she confirmed. He looked at her, the way he had looked at her since the livery stable, the full, unguarded version. And she looked back the same way, and they stayed in that for a moment before the crowd around them made it impossible to stay quiet any longer. Ruth said something. Henry said something. Pete said something that made everyone laugh. Samuel Henderson asked Elizabeth if she had brought anything from Chicago, which made Clara look mortified, and Elizabeth laughed genuinely. And in all of it, the noise in the crowd, and the cold November air at Willow Creek Station. Thomas Walker stood beside Elizabeth Morgan with her medical bag in his hand, and she stood beside him with everything she had brought from Chicago, and everything she had built in Wyoming, and everything that was still ahead of them. The station platform where she had fallen. The same boards, the same Wyoming sky, and nothing else the same at all. People in the valley told the story for decades afterward. They told it the way people tell the stories that matter, not as history, but as something alive. They told it to their children, and their children told it to theirs, and each time it was told the specific details shifted slightly. The way living things shift, but the center of it held. A nurse arrived in Willow Creek with nothing but a medical bag and the kind of stubbornness that doesn't know when to stop. A cowboy caught her when she fell and gave her work when she needed it and stood beside her when someone tried to take everything from her again. She fought for his community before she knew it was hers, and he defended her without ever standing in front of her. And somewhere in the middle of the fighting, they built something that held because it was built on the right things. Not rescue, not sentiment. Trust, respect. The honest version of two people seeing each other completely and choosing not to look away. They built a life on the cattle ranch in the North Valley that became over the years something more than a ranch, a place where injured workers could receive real care, where families in the valley knew they had somewhere to turn, where the standards that Elizabeth helped write for the Wyoming Territorial Medical Association became the foundation that young nurses and doctors built their frontier practices on for a generation afterward. Elizabeth never stopped being a nurse. She practiced for 30 more years, long after the frontier had become less frontier and more simply Wyoming, and the world had changed in ways neither she nor Thomas had fully anticipated. Thomas never stopped being a cowboy. He ran the North Valley operation until his hands made certain tasks difficult, and then he ran it through Henry and Pete and a new generation of men who had grown up on the ranch and stayed because they wanted to. I was there for every case she fought. She was there for every season the land demanded something difficult. They buried Anna Walker properly in the spring of 1888, with her name on a stone that said exactly who she was and what she had meant to the man who had loved her. Elizabeth stood beside Thomas at the graveside and held his hand and said nothing because some moments required only presence. And then they went on living, which was what Anna would have wanted and what the world required and what they were both of them built to do. The last thing the stories always said, no matter who was telling them, was this: they were not a love story about two people saving each other. They were a love story about two people who were already capable of saving themselves and who chose with full knowledge of what choosing meant to stop doing it alone. That was the real story. That was the one worth telling. And every version of it in every telling ended the same way, with a woman stepping off a train in November, and a man walking toward her with complete intention, and a valley full of people who understood that what they were witnessing was not the beginning of something. It was proof that the most enduring things were the ones built slowly, honestly, and on ground that two people had earned together. That was what they were. That was what they built. And it was enough.